Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Regenerative Ag in the Middle of the Mitten. I'm Marie Coper, Group Leader of the Mount Pleasant Chapter of Citizens Climate Education. We've got a great panel here this morning that we want to share with you. I'm sure you'll find our panelists very friendly as well as knowledgeable and eager to answer your questions. So type them in as you think of them, type them into the chat, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end of the program in the last 30 minutes. Okay. As I mentioned, I'm Marie Coper, Group Leader of the Mount Pleasant Chapter of Citizens Climate Education. CCE's mission is to help us effectively use our duty as citizens to educate ourselves and members of Congress about needed legislation. In this case, ours is Climate Solutions. Our sister organization is Citizens Climate Lobby, in which citizens practice democracy by advocating directly with our members of Congress about that legislation. Although we agree with scientists and 3,700 economists that tell us a price on carbon is the market signal needed to reduce climate change and its impacts, we know there's no one silver bullet to such a complex problem. We therefore also lend our support to a number of complementary solutions like sequestering carbon in plants and soil, which increases crop yields for farmers and reduces climate impacts for everyone. That brings us to today's collaboration with Isabella County Extension Office on regenerative agriculture. I'm pleased to introduce Paul Gross, MSU Extension Educator for Isabella County. He'll tell you how he got into this work and then introduce each panelist for their opening remarks. After that, we'll open it up for your questions and answer as many as we can get to. Paul?
Well, good morning, Marie, and good morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and collaborate with you on this. I've been working, well, for quite a few years in the central Michigan area with farmers, primarily the last several on cover crop soil health. And cover crops and soil health really fit well with the regenerative agriculture. And I'm just kind of excited to listen to some of our panelists and talk about some of the things that we see farmers do as it relates to regenerative ag and soil health. And I think one of the things in the advertisement was the movie The Living Soil, and that's just a tremendous video. If you haven't had a chance to see it, I think it really explains a lot of the things that are really important to agriculture. And in the light of climate change, you know, the farmers are usually at the tip of the spear when it comes to climate change and weather patterns. And so I'm anxious to hear what the other panelists have and have a discussion today on carbon sequestration. There's a lot of activity now going on, as Marie mentioned, with carbon sequestration, and a lot of the industries are getting involved in that, in their sustainability efforts to sequester carbon and manage climate change. So with that, I'm going to introduce, kind of go down through, excuse me, and introduce the rest of the panelists. And I guess first up, Bob Thompson. Bob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Again, my name is Bob Thompson. My personal background is that I'm a fourth generation farmer in the mid-Michigan, central Michigan area. Grew up on a dairy farm and currently operated as a cash crop beef operation. Professionally, I worked for the Farm Service Agency as a county level manager, a county executive director. I did that for 33 years, beginning back in the late 70s through 10 years ago. I retired and I became the president of the Michigan Farmers Union, which is a branch of the National Farmers Union. And I would like to give you their website address. Is just simply nfu.org. And you can find a lot of information on that particular page that will tie to the climate discussions that we're going to be having today. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Bob. Sarah Franzek, welcome. I'm glad you could join us.
Glad to be here.
You could introduce yourself and talk and talk about what you do and a little bit your
Sure.
background that you bring to the table here.
Sure. My name is Sarah Franzak. I'm an environmental management educator with Michigan State University Extension. I'm based in Hillsdale County, so I'm down there in the last tier of counties, if you don't know where that is. So I grew up in Southern Michigan on a laying hen and row crop farm. And I have a master's degree in ecology. And I kind of use that to work, and I've worked in conservation as a watershed technician, as a meat technician. So a lot of different sort of conservation jobs, but I also have worked as an engineering coordinator for a local municipality and a biology instructor. So I have quite a variety of experience sort of surrounding water quality and soil health. So I use all that experience and I work with farmers through extension to help them make choices on their farms that affect the environment.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to introduce Aaron. Aaron is our farmer for today. And just for a point, that picture of that nice radish you see is from Aaron's farm, taken last fall, the part of the cover crop he put in. So welcome, Aaron. Could you introduce yourself and maybe some thoughts about regenerative ag, and I guess anything you want to say?
All right. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me here, folks. I'm a farmer, part-time farmer here in Bay County, Michigan. Been doing cover crops for probably about 7 years now. 100% no-till and cover crops for about 3 or 4 years. And you know, regenerative agriculture, I think it's the way to do things, and I do it on my farm. And I guess if I didn't think it was a thing to do, I wouldn't be doing it on my farm. And I think that the rest of the folks in the, you know, I guess in the country are coming around. I've seen things change a lot. I've seen things change a lot over the past 7 years that I've been involved in this, from, you know, regenerative ag not being in magazines or talked about much, to, you know, Successful Farming or Farm Journal having a whole magazine or a whole magazine dedicated just to it. And you know, so I've seen some great improvements. I think it's a great thing to do, but it takes quite a while. I'm still not 100% comfortable after 5 years of doing things, still playing and tweaking with things. And Paul and I just talked yesterday, actually, and it's pretty interesting. Yesterday was a great day here with 20+ mile-an-hour winds and seeing just the erosion effects on things. So very, very neat. And you know, I think it's the way of the future for farming, and very passionate about it. And I like to be involved in this stuff because I think it is the way to go. So and my, you know, I guess I say my real job is I'm a mechanical engineer. Been doing the mechanical engineering for what, about 22 years now, and farming for about 30. So that's my background. And like I said, thank you very much, and looking forward to the presentation.
Well, I always appreciate Aaron, talking with Aaron, because he wears his engineering hat and he wears the farmer's hat about adopting these practices. And it keeps my feet kind of on the ground as to when I start thinking of and suggesting different types of practices, and he will ask those tough questions about the risks that farmers take, the economics involved in those things. So it's fun to talk. I think he's going to be a great addition to the panel here today. So the last panelist, Brendan, would you like to introduce yourself and a little of your background and some of the work you've been doing?
Yes, good morning. Thanks. Thanks for the invite, Marie and Paul. Really pleased to join you this morning. I'm on the academic sort of side, I suppose, of I'm a soil scientist and a soil microbiologist by training. I'm not at the land grant. I'm not at the land grant currently. I'm at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. But I sort of came to soil. Just a quick background. I'm a Kentuckian, so I grew up in Kentucky. So today, some folks may be aware there's a very big day in Kentucky, the first Saturday in May. But my experience was growing up around small tobacco farmers, which no longer exist quite so much anymore. And that was interesting to see farming on a very small scale. Your neighbors are helping each other out. Very small acreages of a cash crop. And I got interested in soil and soil science pretty early. And sort of like Sarah, I got interested in ecology and saw the sort of connection between the things that are living in the soil and how important that is to soil fertility, and how many ecosystem processes are kind of flow through the soil, but then, how critical it is to farming. So ever since sort of undergrad, I've been trying to piece those different parts together, the research and thinking about how it impacts farmers. I got hooked up with Paul because I started to do some work in soil health. And my big question, which I'll talk a little bit about today, was, we're developing all these metrics for soil health, and it's sort of a new paradigm for information that we can share with farmers about their fields and how to manage them, and how management might change their soil. And a lot of those new measures were developed on manicured, perfect little field sites that are kind of treated the same way for years on end. And I was wondering how do they react on farmer fields, and how can we understand what farmers know about their own fields in comparison to what the tests tell us. So I can talk a little bit about that today. And anything else about whatever I can share about how soil carbon works and soil microbes process carbon, and some of these finer scale processes. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Brendan. I'm kind of excited to hear some of the things that you had to say, because I still talk a lot about some of the experiences you had with the research we had. And a lot of times, it's always nice to know how those soil processes work. So I asked Brendan if he would maybe share a few slides about some of the research that he's done, and how, we're really talking about carbon sequestration and paying for carbon. And, so how do those processes work, to help us better understand those processes, and maybe those tests, those indicators that industries are using to pay farmers?
Well, that's definitely it's a work in progress at several levels. The former lab I kind of learned at originally just kind of wrote an article about the urgency of linking field scale measures of carbon with landscape levels of carbon. That's a real challenge for researchers right now, because we're trying to link what happens in a farmer's field, and then understanding, well, across this landscape, whether it's Mount Pleasant or Isabella County, or different regions of Michigan, how does that scale up to what we're really doing for soil carbon? Within that same sort of paper, and I'll list some of the recommendations that they suggest. They kind of describe the key processes that soil scientists have gone through for thinking about sequestering soil carbon over the years. And it used to be thought if you plant a lot of plants that have really carbon that's hard to break down, then that would be your best strategy for building soil carbon. So, let's say corn stalks compared to soybean stover. Corn stalks is going to take a while to break down. You maybe rotated through corn years ago and you still see the stubble in there and it's hard to break down. Well, that's kind of, there's been a little bit of a shift in that as we've looked closer and closer at the microbes, and especially what's going on underground. So much of the carbon that's coming in both above ground and through the roots is getting processed through soil microbes that are consuming that carbon. And every time they consume that carbon, microbes they're like us. They eat, plates of food like us, plates of carbon, whether it's, the eggs I had for breakfast or bread, and then they breathe out CO2. So the fields are breathing out CO2, but every time they do that, they're also adding a little bit of CO2 in their biomass to the field. So that seems to be a really key component for understanding how we build soil carbon. It's not just adding carbon. If you added a bunch of sawdust to your field, that sawdust isn't going to go away for a while. It's letting the microbes do the work of processing that carbon, and that seems to stabilize it more. So that's a key component. And then along with that, such an important thing is this talk of tillage, and I hope Aaron will talk more about his practices, is the soil environment itself. So microbes are important, but also the complexity of that soil environment. Every time we kind of remove that complexity through tillage and kind of flatten the ecosystem, so to speak, and mix up those aggregates, we lose a lot of the complexity that also helps to store a lot of that carbon. So that's both an opportunity in the sense that we know that reducing tillage and safeguarding that soil environment will help build soil carbon. But it's also a challenge because there's such a temptation to go in sometimes and do some tillage, whether it's, and there's all different levels, I'm sure, of folks that are committed totally to no tillage and will always be tempted to maybe go in once in a while. So that soil environment and keeping it intact is just another really critical part of storing carbon. And I guess the final point I'll make on that is just that there's a lot of talk of all the diversity in soil, and that's a real thing that I focus on a lot, measuring the microbes that are in soil, understanding what they do. And one thing that we've found, and lots of people have found, is the diversity is really important. And there's a lot of talk of the diversity of microbes in soil, but there are so many different types of microbes. It's not even that you change the diversity so much when you till or when you manage soil badly. There's still a lot of microbes there. It's more the microbes that you favor when you treat your soil right. So microbes that are eating sort of fresh carbon and turning over that fresh carbon, rather than microbes that are adapted to an environment where they're going to thrive in a system where there's no vegetation on the ground over the winter. They're just going to consume that carbon. They're adapted to that harsh environment, so to speak. And the diversity might change, but the composition might change when you treat soil differently. So diversity matters, but it's really the composition of the microbes that you have in there, and that's a real focus of research too. So I'll leave it at that. And there's it gets complex pretty fast, but I'm happy to answer questions at whatever level before I go too much further.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Marie, do you have a question?
Well, I was just wondering, do you have a round number on are we talking hundreds of microbes, thousands of microbes, different types that are available, potentially? Of course.
That's a great question. So really in a gram of soil, or whatever measure you want to take, just in a handful of soil, there's billions of microbes. Billions. And just for comparison, and sometimes this creeps people out, but our cells in our body they're pretty big cells compared to microbes, right? And the microbes are very tiny, even though there's also a cell, but there's a lot more microbes in us, in our guts, on our bodies, than there are cells on us. So that's a hard concept to think about, but it just gives you an idea of the scale, that there might be 30 million cells in our body, but that we're dwarfed by the number of cells that of microbes that are on our skin and in our guts, and it's sort of the same thing with soil. Soil you pick up, it might not look living and breathing, but boy, even if it's an often a beat up soil, it'll have a lot of bacteria in there. So yeah, it's on the order of billions. And then, I tend to be a little bit focused on microbes, but there's a whole other world of, worms and mesofauna and a whole food web that's part of the way carbon cycles too.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and so impressive that we know that and appreciate that. Yeah, the first time I found out that human beings are made up of more microbes and bacteria than human cells, it was mind-boggling. But yeah, it's a complex system, the whole world. Thank you, Brendan.
Sure.
So I guess I'd like to ask maybe Brendan a question too. And we're talking about, of course, we're talking about carbon sequestration, to remediate climate change. How much carbon can we reasonably expect if we adopt regenerative practices in tons per acre? There's a pretty big number that's out there if we're really going to impact the climate change. What we have to sequester. Can ag do it? Can we do it with those practices?
So there's maybe three buckets that can fall into. One is sort of a theoretical bucket, which is what do we know from studying soil in terms of how much carbon soils can sequester, and sort of the outlier figure for that is that if we let's just start with a year-to-year practice that soils in places like Michigan can store about 4 molecules of carbon per 1,000 molecules that are being emitted on a yearly basis. And that's a lot. That would be a huge amount of carbon, on the order of gigatons across the Midwest. So that sounds a little confusing, but if I just put it in comparison terms, let's say that about 15% of the carbon emissions globally are coming from agriculture and from changes in land use. So by that, I mean, if I read this morning, they cleared 30 Manhattan-sized pieces of land in the Amazon this year. So that's the land use that's releasing carbon. And about that amount, we're talking 15%, that's about 2 billion tons of carbon per year are being released by agriculture. So that can be reversed, and about 20% of our emissions can be taken down in agriculture, can be removed from agriculture. But remember, we're net producers right now. So the theoretical is one thing. We can draw down a lot of carbon. The second basket is sort of the economic, right? And we'll probably talk about this today, but all that it's going to take to transition in terms of equipment, all the different players that are involved to get management to a level where we're actually undertaking those practices that will sequester carbon. That means planting more legumes. That means reducing your nitrogen input. That means more no-till. That's the economic and sort of practical end of things. And then I think there's sort of a third bucket of things that is sort of systemic in society. Like, to what extent can we, and that's maybe what partly this is about today too, is society going to support some of these changes, right? It's a systemic change, and expecting millions of farmers to undertake this, they're going to need an incentive. So there's sort of the practical part of it too. And one of the things I wonder about is there's so much land, for example, that's rented across the country. And Aaron just mentioned this morning, he's been at this, anyone who's undertaking these practices, they're dedicated for years and years to these practices. And things like rented land, you might not treat the same way as your own land, right? So that's 3 different ways that I think about it. But I know from the soil science point of view, it's very theoretically possible. And I wonder about how to break up the how that can get done. You know, if Isabella County became a region where this was a real focal point, then that might seed, you know, activity in other counties, or if it happens at the federal level. I think there's a lot of ways that you can go about this, but certainly from the soil science point of view, you can store an awful lot of carbon. And what's more important than that is that hopefully it should help farmer livelihoods and at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great. Sarah, you unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think when we think about incentives, there's things that aren't just cash that are incentives. So we get better soil, and that can give us better crop yields, right? But there's also an infrastructure point of view that needs to be taken into account, because if you have good soil health, you're using cover crops, you've got filter strips, and you know, if you're doing those things, you also have a lot less cost in cleaning out your ditches. There's less cost for the drain commissioner or whatever your structure is in your county to have to spend money on replacing culverts. You have to, as we see like stronger storms, with climate change, we're also seeing more roads getting washed out. If we have better control of the soil that's in our fields, then we don't fill up our ditches with dirt, which means our culverts work and our roads don't blow out, right? So there's a lot of other benefits. There's also benefits connecting the rural landscape and the more urban landscape, because our bigger cities tend to be at the mouths of rivers, and they see a lot more flooding than we do in rural landscapes. So there's a connection there that should incentivize those larger cities to work with smaller municipalities to arrange a co-beneficial, right, kind of system that allows for them to work together to reduce flooding in those places. And all of that has to do with how healthy soils are in fields.
So Sarah, are there any examples in the country where you have those rural landscapes, those municipalities working together with individuals in those watersheds that's successful?
I can think of a lot of problematic ones, Paul. I can't. No, I tried it in the city that I worked for. It was really difficult to set up, even between like a small city and the rural landscape. Because there's a ownership of water and space that's kind of in our heads that we sort of have to push against a little bit when we talk about how water moves through landscapes, right? And you know, like if one landowner is putting a bunch of dirt into a waterway, right? And then what happens is like the guy downstream complains that so-and-so did this and it ended up this way, right? We've all heard that. If you live in a rural space, you've heard like, oh, you know, Joe dumped like all of his dirt down the thing and it's his fault and I don't want to clean it up, right? So it's much more common that it comes out in problems instead of solutions, Paul, I'm sorry. But it needs to be a mindset that at the local level of how we work with the other governmental organizations that surround us, right? The township needs to work with the small cities and the villages, and they need to work with the private landowners who then in turn work with NRCS or, you know, DNR or whoever is there trying to help put in those kind of practices that prevent some of these issues.
So I have a quick question. How do you get that to happen?
Are those policy questions? Bob, Marie?
That's what I'm thinking.
So, yeah, so just one, I guess, comment is, it's interesting that you talked about, you have the different companies, different state organizations, federal organizations that it's how do you pay for this stuff? And every business has its own way of doing things, right? And you have to convince whoever makes the decisions within that organization what to do, how to do, what they're going to do, and set the goals and so on and so forth. And the interesting part of that is every farmer is the same way, right? Every farm is its own business and everybody does things differently, right, wrong, or indifferent, right? I'm sure they think it's the best thing to do, and that's why they make the decisions they do. So then it's a matter of how do you influence stuff like that. And I don't say unfortunately, every company makes decisions primarily based on economics, right? So it becomes an economic question, really. You're going to hear a beep here in just a second, so ignore that. But so that's what I see as being one of the biggest problems with getting a lot of this stuff to be mainstream on the agricultural side or the farmer side is it's an economic thing, and things get thrown out there. You have less equipment, it helps your bottom line. One of the biggest challenges I see, and I have seen in my doing things, is farming is the economics is a year in, year out thing. So the economics are done on a yearly basis, and the cover crops and stuff like that are really, it's a long-term thing, and those two don't match up. Even if you wanted to do it, it becomes very difficult because the money isn't there, the capital isn't there. And what I have seen over the years of trying to do these things with, I call them strategic partnerships, trying to partner with different organizations like the Nature Conservancy or Michigan State Extension. They need to have the money, right? So the capital is a huge issue with all of that. So anyway, I'd be interested to hear comments on that.
One thing that came to my mind when you said that farmers are kind of year in and year out, and so cover crops are a hard sell. I see a lot of livestock farms that adopt cover crops easier. And I think you're right, it is a mindset thing. When you're dealing with something that's there all the time, you're not really thinking about like my crop year. You constantly have your livestock enterprise, and sometimes cover crops are there to help the livestock as a food stock, right? But I think it's a different kind of mindset, and I think some livestock farmers tend to take to cover crops a little bit easier because of that. I mean, maybe I'm grouping them together too much, Paul, but you have more experience.
I wonder, just on basis of scant reading, I'm asking you experts. It seems like I've seen some areas where the farmers who are doing, farmers talk to their livestock raising neighbors and trade off. Does that make sense? Do you know of any of that sort of thing happening, so that the from the other's enterprise?
So one of the principles of regenerative agriculture is the introduction of animals into the field somehow, into the system, right? Whether that's including manure in the process, right? Bringing manure in and putting it down, or grazing animals. And we know Jason Roundtree at MSU. He has done a lot of research about carbon sequestration in grazing systems. So that's some really cool stuff to look at if you haven't seen it. Having, like, if you are a crop farmer, working together with the livestock farmers in your area really provides an excellent service for your soil. And I don't know, maybe Brendan, do you have any research about introduction of manure?
Could I make one comment on that? I guess I agree with you 100%. You know, there's a lot of research out there that if you want to, and they kind of say, if you want to supercharge the health of your soil, cover crops and introducing livestock and all that is the way to go. And I agree with that 100%, but I will tell you, I've tried to do this for probably 5 years. Very, very difficult for a crop farmer to partner with a livestock person for various reasons. And we could spend an entire probably 2-3 hours talking about that. But if you want to do it on a large scale, so if you want to make it scalable, and I guess my goal with a lot of this is looking at it, how do you produce a system, introducing things and be able to make it scalable, which means where it works everywhere, but on a larger scale. And I always go back to, there's a reason that it used to be when my parents were kids, that everybody had livestock and 80 acres and livestock and very much diversity, right? And you'll hear that in a lot of discussions. But there's a reason people went away from doing that, because some people like it, some people don't, right? They're specialized in certain areas. And it's a tough thing, but how do you start simple? And then you can always get complex, and everybody, you start getting complex. And I think there's a lot of tweaking that has to happen on every individual farm when you start doing that. Whether it's, my problem is location to a livestock organization or a company. I can't put manure on, or I wouldn't say can't. It becomes not very financially feasible to put manure on because of hauling the manure. It doesn't work very well. So there's a lot of things that come into play there, so it's how do you implement these things on a large scale, so it actually, or how could you do it on a large scale, and then get into a little bit more detail from that perspective. I guess I'd be interested to hear thoughts on that.
I have a few thoughts, but I don't want to take over the conversation.
We could talk offline or something too. I have a huge passion around this, as Paul will attest, and I would actually like to see this. So I'll frame it out very simply. I'm actually just got on the board of directors for the Soil Conservation Service in Bay County. My goal is to make Bay County the flagship county for cover crops and no-till, and so that's my passion.
My first thought is, one of the big issues for me is the fencing, right? When you put livestock out there, you need fencing. And so then I think about how I can pay for fencing or movable fencing. And then I think about FSA and NRCS and how they can help with those kind of things. The hard part is that you have to have, according to their standards, you have to have livestock out there for a certain amount of time. I don't know the standard by heart. But it's not very regenerative agriculture friendly the way it's written. So having support of that in policy through NRCS and their EQIP program, that would be really helpful for regenerative agriculture. So you can provide temporary fencing to animals if you could get them there, right? The second thought I had is about the manure shed project that LTAR is running. And I think most of that's been focused in the like Pennsylvania, North Carolina area, some in like that section, Virginia. They've been doing a lot of research about how manure is created in one section and feed comes from another section of the country, and then being able to connect those places back and to put on the manure that was created from the feed that it came from. Does that make sense? So they're calling that concept manure sheds, and they're working on characterizing those across the country. And I think that'll help with kind of what you're saying about how do I get this manure back? How do I get it to where it's from? And, you know, part of that comes in the technology too, of processing manure, getting some of the water out, say, so you can truck it longer distances. Those are all really helpful with that kind of an issue.
100% agree.
So you talked about policy, and I think it's time to maybe have Bob, you know, some of the, oh, I'm sorry, Marie.
No, that's,
You have a
Bob's
question.
fine too. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just think we, you know, how do we influence, how do we, I guess influence is probably the best. How do we influence policy with some of the data that Brendan's generating and some of the issues that we have? Bob, can you talk about that a little bit, being with Farm Service and National Farmers Union over time?
Well, thanks, Paul. And I think the earlier comments are well taken. I think that your farm economy is what typically drives conservation measures. Over my lifetime, when the ag economy was thriving, more farmers took more of an interest in adopting practices. They had the resources to do the practices, and they allowed themselves the luxury of making things happen. As far as establishing policy, I think what we need to recognize is the political reality in a lot of areas, and I think Brendan touched on that, as Sarah did. And the political reality is that you need to have the politicians that are willing to put programs and policies in place that will help the smaller family farm operations and generate the income. I mean, we ebb and flow in farming. We go all one way for a while, and then we go all another way for a while, and we never quite ever settle in the center. Reference to Aaron in Bay County, and I congratulate him and encourage him to participate with the Soil Conservation Service there. Back in the mid-70s, there was projects, policy initiatives that were forerunners of what we know as the EQIP program, and the CRP programs and like that, where farmers were encouraged through people like Brandon and Paul and Sarah to get rid of their moldboard plows and to chisel plow. And there were incentives, cash incentives in order to do that. Once people got that pretty much in place, which solved some problems, then they went to the CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, cover crops, and the like. And I'm not quite sure how we turn the clock back to where, frankly, somebody commented, the diversity that we had on farms, my grandfather's farm, even the way we farmed as kids, Paul, Um, the economic realities don't allow you to do that today. I've got ground that's much better suited for hay crops than it is cash crops. The dilemma there is I put the hay crops in, I've got to be able to sell that crop to somebody to make the income. And that's what it boils down to. It's an income system. So, but we need to get, as agriculture, specifically to the Farmers Union, and I know Marie on the Citizens Climate Lobby, we need to be engaged to the highest levels. We in agriculture need to be involved with our policy makers, our legislators, whether that be at the state level or the federal level, and encourage them to adopt policies that will enhance the ultimate goal rather than a political goal that may or may not be out there.
Can I add, like, being locally involved on your planning commissions and those kind of organizations too is really helpful to move infrastructure and that kind of projects forward. And in being on like township boards, that's really helpful.
You know, economics always kind of plays a big part in so much of this stuff. And I think Bob, you mentioned it too. And I know I always I don't pick on Aaron. I always ask Aaron for, you know, his observations, you know, since he started to adapt some of the regenerative type practices, which is, you know, he feels it's beneficial. Has it improved your bottom line? Has it helped your bottom line? You know, Aaron, you have any comment on that?
Looks like he may be.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to take myself off mute. Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple challenges that I've come to, and as Paul knows, and you know, I've spent an awful lot of time and have a passion, and I'm driven to do this, okay, and I'm going to make it work. But I can't make it work without the economics lining up, and that is my guiding light, is economics and really engineering principles behind how to make this stuff work is my guiding light. And I take that as my boundaries to keep me in line, because I think if you don't, you get out of line. So, you know, I'll give an example. This kind of goes to policy and how things aren't set up the best, and you know, technical expertise is important. A lot of farmers, I feel, are what I call operators, right? They just want to farm. They just want to go in and plant the 5,000 acres they have and harvest it, and that's all they're staffed to do, right? They're not in it for the research and development side of things and trying to figure new things out. But that being said, you go to like your NRCS and stuff like that, and try to find technical expertise is very, very difficult. And you know, and I take the mindset of, I go into some of these programs, they say, all right, single species cover crop, I decide I'm going to do cereal rye. So they tell you, here's the range of what you have to plant, and they don't tell you how to plant it. They don't tell you necessarily what to plant, but I can tell you for a fact that cereal rye, if you plant it right, you can do it you can get the results you're looking for with probably less than their minimum that they tell you can plant. And Paul knows that I push the envelope on that pretty hard, and that's just what I do, but many people will not. So that comes down to economics, right? You look at it and you go, how can I make money at this? Or how can I do it and bring the best value to my farm? So I look at those practices, the economics of how do I bring value to my farm? And it has to bring value or I'm not going to do it. And if somebody goes and puts down 2 bushel the acre of cereal rye and it doesn't work for them, most farmers, it'll be the last time they do it for many, many years because they don't forget very easy. So that's my feedback on that. And that's the way that I do things. And I don't really compare myself much to my neighbors. I just do what I feel is the best thing to do and bring value to my farm. So I don't have a lot of comparisons to what other folks do.
And if I could interject here, I think that inability to find the specific technical assistance that you need, that has been a political policy issue for a number of years, where research and development dollars have continually declined. And you folks with MSU, I'm sure you've been fully aware of that. I've watched it from the outside. But those are the types of programs and policies that need to be addressed from the political spectrum to get the research dollars back into those areas that have been struggling, and then be able to go forward.
Yes, I also find that each of those county offices varies on the amount of technical expertise available, right? Because some people are more experienced than others in different things. And I feel like they're really understaffed in a lot of places. And so even if they have the expertise, maybe they don't have the time to really like hone down on your specific problem. I think that's where MSU Extension comes in and MGuard comes in, the Department of Agriculture, where we can help with some of those technical things. But we have to all kind of work together and as agencies to provide everybody with what they need. And I think the other thing, Aaron, that I'm really interested in how you think about this, because this is what comes to my head, because you're talking about economics, but to me there's this other thing, and there's this ecosystem services, which researchers have had a terrible time putting numbers on and putting value on. But I think farmers intrinsically get it after a while, like after 5-10 years of doing something, they're like, there's this other factor, whether it's the diversity that Brendan's talking about, that really provides that extra value in their field, or if it's providing space for pollinators for a different kind of vegetable crop, say. There's those ecosystem services that we don't talk about like we should when we talk about economics.
I agree. I mean, I agree with that 100%. But I think, the first step, if you want it to be scaled up and things to be done at a large scale, those things become like putting pollinators in, putting stuff aside for this, that there's complexities involved in that. And that means farmers have to understand that, right? And I would say that I believe that, and this is my own opinion, right? I don't have anything to back it up other than observations and my thoughts. But I believe that there's a lot of farmers out there that they don't understand the chemistry behind, they don't understand what chemistry can do, which most of the stuff that we talk about ends up being some level of chemistry involved in that, right? The microbes, all of the things that are in the soil. It's very complex how all this stuff works together, which is part of the reason there's not good numbers on it, because they're starting to understand. And I feel it's because they just got to the point where they can measure some of these things. but a lot of it comes down to complexities. And there's a lot of farmers, they do it the way they do it because dad and grandpa did it that way, right? And it works. And there might even be some out there that they till the ground because they like tilling ground, right? I mean, there's a lot of social things behind some of this too, but in order to make changes, it becomes challenging. I think you have to have a real understanding or have people that do understand it. So there's a lot of challenges behind that, but I agree with you, that, there's a lot more behind it than just, that you say economics, economics is a big thing, right? A lot that impacts it.
I'm thinking as you are discussing this that a couple of things in terms of how to socially address this, and that is that I've seen that the state of Michigan is putting a particular emphasis, I know, on helping municipalities address their abilities to cope with the climate impacts, the flooding and whatnot that you're talking about, and that ties in so well with the whole watershed concept, and how to. I'm thinking that if the state entities can be helpful, because I think we're just at a critical time right now when there is real interest in doing that, combining these silos, if you will, of different interests, but seeing how they overlap and how to help them work together for a greater effect. And I agree 100%, Sarah, that our local activity is crucial, because that's where it all actually percolates up in terms of who we vote for at the local level on up, that will support what we are learning is critically important. And I'm thinking that's it's not just farmers that need to, that need to understand this or want to understand this. It's all of us consumers, because then we can also vote accordingly and advocate accordingly, and appreciate that if food costs go up any amount, that we are investing, if you will, in a healthier world, in more nutritious food, in fewer climate impacts with flooding and runoff, and that we all benefit. So just how to frame it so that we are all involved in this process. It's not just a farming issue, as I see it. So maybe if we can think about the engaging a societal network that will address all of these issues. I think that there are just share that concept with every organization that we're involved with.
Brendan, you've been chomping at the bit to get in here a couple of times.
Well,
you've got the floor.
I really want to come back to what Marie said, but also based on what Sarah and Bob and Aaron had mentioned. I know Paul wanted me to share some of the data I have from Isabella County, which I'll try and do real quick, because I hope it links directly to some of these issues that we're touching on. And I'll try to be brief and simple. Can everyone see my sort of slides here?
Yes.
And I wonder, can folks see my pointer when I move it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, great. So with a lot of help from folks like Paul, we did a study measuring soil health across the state. We picked 3 counties representing 3 different regions. This is Presque Isle, this is the middle of the Mitten, and this is Van Buren County. So 3 different soil types, and we measured soil health on grain farms. We asked farmers to pick out numerous different fields, including their very best, what they considered the very best field, and their very worst field, the problematic field. And then we compared it to other fields, like a field that wasn't under row crop production. So it could have been CRP ground, it could have been a hay field, something that wasn't in row crops. And again, we're coming from the point of view that, a lot of these soil health measures, they're developed on these sort of pristine field stations, and we say, oh, look, we do no-till and till, and we get these different numbers, and now we have a way forward to measure soil health. Well, what does that really mean on farms that are a lot more complex than than some of these controlled field trials? So some of these are going to look a little messy, but I'll just try and take you through them. So north, central, south is at the top here. And then this is just how the farmers described their different best fields and worst fields. So, how they yielded was a big determinant of whether it was a best field, but it was also things like drainage, disease. A best field, they might test different practices on. This is my best field. I'm going to see if this works, this new practice or this new tillage or this new crop or a cover crop. And then the worst fields, it wasn't just yield, it was also how the soil worked and the chemistry was off, or they knew it had a bad management history. It's a whole collection of different reasons why farmers chose the fields that they chose for best and worst field. And again, mentioning that, when these controlled field trials, we might do real contrasting managements, but a lot of these had a real overlap or a real diversity in the way that they were managed. Some were no-till, some were chisel plowed, some were a mixture. Depending on the crop, some had different rotations. So we're kind of taking that a little bit out of the equation and saying, okay, it's not just down to the way that they're managed necessarily. And here's a big take home. So this looks a little bit complex, but I'll take you through it hopefully clearly. So these are the different regions, north, central, south, and these are broken down by different measures of soil health. So physical measures of soil health, so things like aggregation and water storing capacity, biological measures of soil health. So those are things like carbon and nitrogen turnover, and then chemical. So pH, nitrate, potassium measures, things that you might get in a typical soil test, and then an overall measure of soil health. And here in the center is Isabella County. And one thing I really want to, I should point out the last thing, which is that the black is the best field, the white is the worst field, and the NRC is the non-row crop field. So if you just focus on the center panel here, we can see that the red means that there's a difference between the fields. So we know the overall take home from the study is that the biological and the physical measures of soil health are really distinguishing between the best and the worst fields. But all these chemical measures that we usually measure in a typical soil test, they're not distinguishing between best and worst fields. So why is that? You go and you take a soil test and there's no real difference between these chemical measures in your best field and your worst field, and they may be dramatically different in terms of yield and how they work and all that. So it's partly because they're good farmers and they're following the typical soil test. They're adding, the inputs that are suggested from the soil test. We're managing for chemistry, but we're not managing necessarily for the biology, and we're not managing for the physical properties of the soil. So in terms of metrics and how we guide farmers and information that's used, whether it's through NRCS or through MSU, there needs to be a change. We've managed based on nitrogen inputs and phosphorus inputs for decades, since the 50s at least. And there needs to be a different set of information that we can communicate with farmers. Another take home from this is that this came from farmer knowledge. The farmers know whether they're best and worst fields, and our little study in Isabella County showed that when they know it's a best or a worst field, it's because of the physical characteristics and because of the biological characteristics which we can pick up the test. So that sort of validates this soil health approach, that the farmers know what they're talking about. But then it also says now we have a writ of a roadmap for using different testing methods to help to aid farmers, to arm farmers with more information. It's also a message, I think, to scientists and to extension folks to say, okay, now I need to collaborate even more with farmers because they know their fields. This isn't a controlled field study. They know their fields. We can learn a lot from what they bring to the table in different fields, how different fields respond to different management practices, and we can try and measure those and kind of combine our knowledge, right? So I think the types of information that we're dealing with is really important, and whether we build incentives around those measurements rather than other types of measurements from the field might be one avenue. But we need to change the conversation about what's important. I'm just putting up a slide here that just lists practices that are regenerative. So perennial types of vegetation, right? So whether that's cover cropping or haying more or changing a rotation, reducing tillage, more infixing plants, higher levels of crop rotation with different types of crops, use of mixtures maybe, or amendments like manure. A lot of these we have touched on. And, probably for the farmers on this call and for Aaron, these are all, technically doable. Economically, it's a different story. So it's bridging these known practices, linking them up with things that we can measure to verify that they're working, and then incentivizing them or making them work economically. So that's hopefully links up a few of the things that folks have said, and we can talk about those. But then also, I think Marie's point about linking these to bigger other issues sort of downstream of agriculture, maybe we can talk about too. So I hope that makes sense.
One piece of legislation that Bob and I'm sure others of you know about too is that's been reintroduced this year, and Senator Stabenow of Michigan, obviously, and Senator Braun. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation. It's called Growing Climate Solutions, and it's gotten mixed responses, but it does deal with so it's about helping farmers enter the carbon offset market, which has controversies. Some people think that's just allows polluters to pollute more, but it is designed to incentivize and give farmers a payback for adopting adopting methods like regenerative farming that do sequester carbon in the soil. And they realize that varies a lot, as Brendan's noting, so that part of the legislation is a whole mechanism for evaluating soil, and so that farmers can know what they've got and can sell it accordingly to people that want to buy offsets. And it also sets up the mechanism for managing that, so that it's not on the farmers to become to add this whole marketing situation. So I think there's a very conscious effort to address that incentive part there. So that's something that folks can look into and again advocate for if they think that's a way to go.
So Brenda, do you think that based on your work with carbon sequestration, do you think that we have the indicators? Can we measure adequately to put a value on it?
So one, I'll refrain from showing more slides, but another thing that we were trying to understand from that study is we can measure carbon in lots of different ways. And sometimes the carbon number that we measure for, let's say, someone who wants to buy a carbon credit, that might be a little different from the carbon number that a farmer's interested in. And, there's a soil health number for active carbon that has been used a lot And we found from our study that it wasn't as good as measuring carbon turnover in the soil, which is a different number. And that carbon turnover in the soil was a much better predictor of what was a best soil. So, so to answer your question, Paul, I think we're going to need to understand how these measurements link together, because I think we really need to incentivize. I'm not necessarily a big carbon credit, swamp the market in carbon credits, but we need to understand when we're building carbon, what's good for the farmer and what's good for the farm, and what's good for these people who want to buy the carbon credits, and make sure that they're aligned. Because we can't build a soil test that's measuring soil carbon and tell and base it off of what say we're sequestering carbon. I think the soil test needs to help the farmer manage. And so I know that in places like Bay County and Isabella County, there's a huge potential to build a lot of soil carbon. I want the right numbers to go to the right people. And I think when you run a soil test and you can tell a farmer, well, you planted rye in this way and it has totally changed the way that you're cycling carbon over 2 seasons, that's much more useful for the long-term goal of building soil carbon than saying, oh, you added 0.5% carbon and we're going to track that over time. I think we need to measure it as the success and livelihood of the farmer, and then the carbon will come. Right. If we're using those types of results to leverage good practices. So, and to me, once those good practices are leveraged, and I think this goes a lot to what Marie and Sarah are saying, we need to be able to link some of those positive practices with what's happening downstream, so that if, the Maumee watershed is up in arms about what's happening in Toledo, they need to be supportive of farmers rather than blame farmers in some ways. We need mechanisms to support farmers. And rather than just say, we're going to impose, we're going to bring the EPA in and impose all these restrictions. I think the way out of this is through these types of regenerative practices and finding metrics to support them. And again, I think it's lost in this, what's technically possible and what is economically and socially kind of making those more viable. Because I think technically it's very viable, but farmers aren't doing it because it's not technically possible. All the practices that I sort of flashed up there, they're all very doable. Any competent and engaged farmer can do them with a little, but the incentives to do them and the economics to do them are the problem.
Right. One thing that might help people think about it is, well, if a lot of your listeners are in like the Saginaw Bay area, there are a ton of road culverts. Drive down the road and count how many culverts you go over. There are just a whole ton in that area, like more than anywhere else in the state. So you want to think about that. And from one project I worked on, I was replacing one road culvert that was in an industrial park. Okay, so it had to be pretty heavy duty. So I had to take out the road culvert, put one in, and put new road on. It cost $1.3 million. If we can prevent spending that kind of money on one project inside of a municipality, and instead prevent the degradation of that infrastructure by investing in the rural landscape, I think in the long run, that's just a whole lot better.
That brings up so important, Sarah, and that brings up the whole issue, I think, of risk management. And I don't know if how that concept is discussed in farming literature, but I think it's huge. I know the Commodities Future Trading Commission, federal agency had a risk management subcommittee that you may know about that just released a few months ago, Managing Climate Risk in the US Financial System. And the agricultural sector was one of the financial systems. I mean, it's obviously a huge part of our economy and commodities. And so they experts from that agriculture sector were involved in listing, analyzing, and reporting what the risk management factors are for agriculture and making recommendations. And again, so maybe this is a piece that we need to bring into the conversation with these other entities so that we realize that we're all connected in our various sectors are all connected in terms of our economic health, our physical health, and social health, and that we can that we need to connect those dots for best effect.
Yes, MSUs, we're actually working on a climate ready farm assessment. So farmers can go through and assess their farms for climate readiness.
Cool.
Which doesn't connect them, like we said, we were talking about connecting systems, but at least it helps that farmer think about their fields and their farm. I wanted to circle back to something that I think it was Aaron. You were talking about financials for your farm and how that mattered. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with another farmer. And he was talking about how he farms his rented fields. And we were talking about the financials of each field and how he decides on whether farming a certain way on that field pays off. And to think kind of the way Brendan was about your best and your worst fields, and am I really making money on my worst field farming it the way I'm farming it? Or do I need to change my practices? Or in the case of the farmer that I was talking to, he was like, I'm gonna get a 5-year lease and I'm gonna put this into CRP and let it rest and get some carbon into the soil, and it'll have some other benefits. But it's hard. I asked him, I'm like, how did you get the landowner to go along with it? Right? He was like, oh, well, he hunts. And so he was fine with it. I mean, but not everybody has hunter friendly landowners. But I think that's another key part of the puzzle. Like, don't farm the worst land just for the sake of farming it. Let's think about this in an economic way. And I wondered if the panelists had any kind of thoughts about that.
I'll just say we've got 10 minutes left on our schedule, and this has been so interesting to me anyway. My grandfather was a farmer, and he knew each crop to put in different sandy soil versus the clay, all of that. So I understand where you're coming from. I don't see any questions in the chat, but sometimes people don't like to type as much as maybe raise their hands. So if there's anyone in the participants that want to ask a question here too, I think we should give them a chance to raise their hand and be, but you'd have to turn on your videos to see your hands, okay? Or you can actually do it via your, if you can see a reactions button down on the bottom of your screen, if you click on that, there's a raise hand button there. So you could do that. So we'll give you that opportunity, but continue with what you were saying. I'm sorry to interrupt. Somebody was beginning to say something here. Was that you, Sarah, or?
She actually was directing.
Well, just.
Oh, go ahead, Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
No, I was just going to comment. Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was just going to comment on what Sarah's last comment was about the rented land and whether or not we can get landowners to go along with what the operator of the farm wants to do. That's a tough one. As an FSA manager over the years, that I was in the office when we had the initial CRP signups back in the early 80s. And the purpose of CRP has completely changed over the years from its original inception, which was to take productive land out of production and put it in a conservation use in order to get production off the market. It was about half weight on the economics of it to get overproduction under control at the time. And it has evolved into, it has to be the absolute worst field that you've got, will help butterflies and pheasants and whatnot. And I think we need to get back into that, but to the point that the landowners over time have tried to use programs like CRP to maintain ownership of their land without having to farm it themselves. And that's where there have been operators that would not be allowed to put it in CRP, on landowners that would not be allowed to put it in CRP because of policies and procedures that are in place to protect, quote unquote, protect unscrupulous people from gaining advantage economically one way or the other. And so but it's a real, ownership of land is a real emotional issue, particularly land that's been in, like our farm, Paul's farm, different ones, where we're multi-generational, and you don't want to lose that control.
Right.
For what that's worth.
So I have one comment there. I think it's great that like for CRP and stuff, I agree 100%. I mean, just throw a scenario. It actually came up just the other day for me with CRP stuff, and that is the fact that what I would like to do, I have a field, I would like to put it in CRP, and it's light ground. I feel I would like to put it in there. I'd like to put some livestock on it and be able to put it in there for the 10-year period, right? But the policy doesn't, the rules make it so that you can't do that. So you can't graze it, at least in my county, is what I'm told. So you can't graze that land. And this goes to the point of introducing livestock into the operation and stuff. It's a very good avenue for me to be able to do that. I mean, I have things lined up where it'd be really awesome. Economics would line up a lot better. You know, there's a risk. I don't have livestock today, so now I have something I have to learn. Not opposed to doing it, but things don't line up. So I put it in CRP. And I suspect I rent the land. CRP is gonna, if it pays for the rent, that's about all it will do. So it's not, then you're taking it out of production, but economically you're breaking even, and that's about it, right? So it just changes the dynamics a lot when you start talking economics.
Well, and that's another one of my pet peeves with policies. We can have lots of them, but that one policy contradicts another policy. Our goal of one contradicts the goal of another. And, as consumers, can we advocate with our legislators to work for greater consistency? And that's not easy. That's not easy. They have every issue on their plate, not just agriculture. And every vested interest in every issue is hammering at them and urging for their own their own economic reasons or ideological reasons for different positions, So it's hard to keep track of what the left hand and right hand are doing. There's no doubt about that. But I think that's our job as citizens to really help our legislators at every level understand the concepts better that they're voting on. And I've had legislators say, you know, we can't keep track of everything, and we need constituents to let us know what is important and why. So urge you to take that on.
Yes. So one thing I want to mention, I think it's an interesting concept, and this is something that I've brought from, you know, my career in corporate America, is I've seen a lot of metrics over the years on stuff, and I've come to the conclusion that metrics are great, right? And they can be good, but the right metrics are very important. If you have the wrong metrics, it can actually be very detrimental to a company, a business, right? So that's where, and I think it was Brendan. I'm terrible with names, but I think it was Brendan that talked about measuring carbon and getting on the right, you know, basically on the same page with measuring carbon, right? So you're doing the same thing, and that's kind of, to me, that's along the lines of having the right metrics, and then people start to align better. These different groups start to align. So it's just interesting when you start talking that stuff.
Very much so.
And this is a little bit reiterating what Aaron said, what Sarah said, but I suppose in terms of metrics and practices, if we can sort of build out and say, well, we're going to manage for soil health by doing these regenerative practices, and then we can go downstream, let's say, of the field and say, well, this metric that we're using to measure, you know, improvements in farming, improvements in soil, this links up pretty good with an improvement over 2-3 years in water quality across this corridor or this drain, whatever it might be. Then, you know, I think that ultimately that builds in a little bit what Marie is touching on too, about building some of these coalitions, right? So the folks who are interested in water quality, they see the value in soil health more concretely. You know, right now, sometimes it can be a little bit tenuous, that connection, but building those connections and saying, okay, there's a direct relationship between supporting, you know, greater expertise in my inner CS office or Paul's office, and what's going on with the drain, and that, you know, now I can get a discount from my drain commissioner or something, or the folks who, you know, from Ducks Unlimited who say, oh, well, the you know, wetlands in this area are much better. Those types of coalition building, I think is, and I think it's what's a key point I'll finish on is just say, you know, I'm excited about building soil carbon. That's a great thing, but it's another one of these things. Well, you know, last decade it was, you know, feeding the world, or last decade, you know, we're always asking farmers to do a bazillion things, and now we got to say, oh yeah, while you're at it, can you build soil carbon so you can save the planet? I think the focus is less helpful sometimes to say we're going to build soil carbon and it's going to offset emissions than if we say we're going to do all these things and we're going to improve soil health, we're going to improve farmer livelihood, and at the same time we're going to help water quality. Oh, and by the way, you know, this is all going to help with soil carbon, and we'll figure those measurements out. But I think some of those combining some of those other things together could be more powerful than just saying, let's go health for leather and build soil carbon.
Yeah. Well, we're getting very close to the end of our time. Whoops, actually, we're a minute over. Paul, any closing thought there you want to?
Well, you said the time was up. Actually,
Well-
this has been very interesting to me, and I think you know, there's just so many moving parts of the whole system, and you know, I think it kind of starts. I think borrowing a piece from, you know, Aaron, you know, the strategic partnerships that are important, you know, up and downstream, you know, from a water standpoint, from economic standpoint. You know, there's a lot of benefits to the community by implementing the regenerative practices on farms. You know, Brendan has pretty much showed us that it can be done. They're all doable and scalable, and you know, it's just how do we move the needle, I guess, is the challenge. Of how do we build these coalitions to accomplish these goals that are going to benefit everyone. That would be my closing shot.
Thank you, Paul. I agree. And I'll just say too, we hope you've all enjoyed learning more about regenerative agriculture. You might save the chat in case to get those links to the panelist information, and a participant added a website here too, or two that for resources, and that's great because that kind of sharing is always useful. If you have more questions, please feel free to contact any of us. We thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to take this opportunity to appreciate all that the soil that we walk on every day and often take for granted, all that it can provide for us. And thank you very much for attending today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone,
Thanks, everyone.
for participating. I appreciate it. I felt like I was at a seminar.
Me too.
Yeah, thank you.
Super.